Could I ask everyone to take their seat, please? I would not speak for more than 2-3 minutes. In inviting Her Excellency Harinder Sidhu to take the floor and let us know her views on the pathways to trade liberalization, I would just like to narrate some recollections of my own interactions with the Australian representatives over the past 30 years or so that I have been involved in trade negotiations. It was in the mid-80s that we were about to launch the negotiations which eventually led to the creation of the World Trade Organization. And at the outset, a group of us in Geneva had constituted what we called a group of the Friends of MFN. And the two leading lights of that group were the Indian representative, which was myself, and the Australian ambassador. The idea at that time was to put as many roadblocks as possible in the negotiations that were about to begin towards the formation of more regional agreements, regional bodies like the European Union and so on and so forth. Now, a little before that, even the United States was in that group. Not formally, but they had sympathies. But by that time, the NAFTA negotiations had begun, so the US had backed out and they were no longer a part of the Friends of MFN. And the other members, of course, New Zealand was another one, but Australia was definitely there. The next thing that I remember is that I was invited by Western Australian government to an event in Perth when we were thinking of the Indian Ocean Rim countries forming an association. And at that time, in the WTO, at that time GATT Secretariat, they had come out with a study which showed they too were moving with the times, that there were several complementarities between regional organizations like the European Union, at that time the European communities, and the multilateral approach. But let me say that my thoughts, which was only reflecting the viewpoint presented in a study of the GATT Secretariat, that there were complementarities, were not appreciated by the Australian audience to which it was delivered. So definitely up to that time, mid-90s, the mood in Australia, or the Australian trade policy circles, was not very much in favor of regionalism. But now, as we all know, the Australian trade policy has been evolving, and today Australia is one of the leading players in the mega regional called TPP. So, we would all like to hear the High Commissioner on this evolutionary course on trade policy which the Australian government seems to have followed. So I would not say anything more on this and hand over the floor straight away to Ambassador Harinder Sidhu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoda, and thank you for that very thought-provoking introduction. I hope that in my address I can do it some justice. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can hear, I'm having a few issues with my voice today, so I'm going to beg your indulgence and patience as I speak today. Thank you so much for coming along today. I very, very much welcome the chance to be here today to explore with you some of the themes in the area of trade policy. First of all, I'd just like to say that as a recent arrival in New Delhi, how very pleased I am to be in India as the High Commissioner of Australia. I think I've picked my time and place well. As a major emerging economy, India has gained a heightened prominence on the world stage. At the same time, as a society undergoing many important transitions, it's a very rich experience becoming better acquainted with what would in any case be a very fascinating country. And as a keen observer of public policy thinking, I take a great interest in the lively deliberations and debates that are taking place on what policies will serve India best for the future. These debates are very important for India and for others such as Australia with a stake in India's future. Importantly too, as the Australian government's senior representative in India, it's very pleasing to me to see the bilateral relationship in such good shape. Some have described it as having reached a high watermark. The texture of the bilateral relationship has become much richer than it once was. Almost 500,000 people out of a total Australian population of 24 million are of Indian origin. There are 53,000 Indian students studying in Australia today, and they make our second largest source of overseas students. And last year, in 2015, 233,000 Indians visited Australia, making India our 8th largest source of visitors. There is an increasing network of collaborative work and other links between our universities and institutions. And commercial ties have deepened significantly. Trade and investment between Australia and India now spans a wide range of industries, products and services, from mineral and energy commodities to sophisticated manufactured goods, from large-scale business services and skills training to niche products in many different sectors. But on the economic front, I'd have to say there is still a lot of unfulfilled potential in the relationship too. One comparison that a number of observers have made is that while Australia's two-way trade with India is at about 18 billion Australian dollars, it's barely more than 1/10 of our trade with China, which currently sits at $150 billion. These amounts are in Australian dollars, by the way. Investment, too, in both directions is well below what it could or perhaps should be. The wish to spur the growth in our economic relationship lay behind the commitment in 2014 between our then Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Abbott, and Prime Minister Modi to reinvigorate negotiations on the Australia-India Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, otherwise known as the CECA. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more a bit later. The interest of both our countries in developing a comprehensive and commercially meaningful agreement leads me to a central theme I want to explore today. And that is the importance of reducing barriers to international trade and the pathways to achieving this. So today I want to talk about three broad themes. First, I think it's worth exploring perspectives on the relationship between trade liberalisation and economic development. Secondly, I want to look at different types of trade architecture which help us move collaboratively towards trade reform. And finally, I'll briefly survey current developments in regional trade agreements, such as raised by Mr. Hoda, and consider where these, as well as bilateral endeavours such as the CECA, could take us. I'd like to start with what is almost a truism. Trade has a critical role in economic growth, and with this, in enhancing our economic well-being. This is perhaps particularly self-evident for a relatively smaller population like Australia's. Exposure to the wider world has been essential in providing a large market for our products and as a source of consumer goods and producer inputs. These products would be perhaps prohibitively costly if Australia tried to source them all in our own country. In keeping with the economic concept of comparative advantage, Australia has fared best when we have allocated our productive resources to the things we do best, using part of the income from those things to import the things that we're relatively less efficient at producing. And there's a long list of manufactured products where Australia has done exactly that. India, of course, has a much larger population. So that has led to a view in some quarters that this means that India can satisfy its growth requirements through its large domestic market. But I think India would be selling itself short if it were to take this stance. We can look at China, a country of similar dimensions to India, to see the example of the enormous contribution that international trade can make to national economic growth. Others in East Asia, like Japan and Korea, also show the profound benefits that deeper international economic engagement can yield. So, to return to Australia's experience, because that's what I know best, we were a very highly protected economy for most of the 20th century. From about the 1920s to about the 1960s, our trade barriers were pretty high. And this did have the effect that we intended. It increased the size of our manufacturing sector. But it also resulted in very low productivity, fostered by an uncompetitive economy. On the surface, on the back of strong international prices for our commodities export, we appeared to be faring quite well for quite a time. But from the 1970s, when commodity prices started to drop, we started to drop down the per capita income ranks of OECD countries. This formed something as a wake-up call for Australia. And the later decades of the 20th century, about the period where Mr. Hoda was working on these issues, saw Australia move from being an inward-looking economy to embracing the rigours and benefits of globalisation, as we carried out a sustained program of trade liberalisation and structural reforms. Trade barriers fell dramatically. Just to give you an example, from the early 1970s to the year 2000, industry protection, mainly delivered through tariffs, fell from an average of 35% to 5%. These changes have served Australia well. They've produced a more competitive and more resilient economy, and the best evidence of that is that Australia has now just clocked up 25 years of uninterrupted economic growth. It's one of the few countries that did not suffer a downturn in the 2008 global financial crisis. We continued to register positive growth. So what about India's experience? I'm sure you know your history much better than I do, but I'll just survey some pertinent facts. India is today recognised as an emerging economic giant. It's now the third largest economy in the world if we measure this on a purchasing power parity basis. But it wasn't always the case. For a long time, India was almost on the periphery of the global economy. It was inward-looking, much like Australia, operating behind high levels of protection. Its share of world trade as a result declined from 2.4% in 1947 to 0.4% in 1990. Barriers to trade, combined with other uncompetitive economic policies, came at a very real cost. Up to the 1980s, India's GDP grew on average by only about 3.5% a year, while per capita income growth averaged only 1.25%. Since the 1990s, India has, of course, undertaken substantial economic reform. The economy has become more market-oriented, including easier access for foreign investment and reductions in tariffs, albeit to still very high levels. India has reaped substantial benefits from its reforms. GDP growth has risen to an average of about 6.5% since the 1990s. The Indian government continues to press ahead with its program to improve the workings of the economy, including in important areas such as tax reform, bankruptcy legislation, and cutting red tape. Australia welcomes these efforts. It will be equally important to achieve reform on the trade policy front, not just because the benefits that flow from trade liberalisation directly, but also because experience shows that reform contributes most powerfully to national growth when it is taken forward comprehensively across the full spectrum of economic policy areas. Increasing efficiencies and removing distortionary policies in the tradable sector complements reforms undertaken elsewhere in the economy and creates a dynamic for overall strong growth. So with that picture, I just want to turn to a discussion about trade agreements and their role. Some general comments first, and then I'll talk about bilateral and regional agreements, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the RCEP. With the benefits it offers, trade reform has often been undertaken unilaterally. Both Australia and India have done this at various times, and others too. The World Bank has estimated that unilateral reforms accounted for about 2/3 of the 20 percentage point fall in average developing country tariffs over the past 20 years. That's a bit complicated to digest, but essentially what's happened in the past 20 years, average tariff rates amongst developing countries has fallen by 20% on average. That's a very, very significant drop. And that has been done unilaterally, not out of trade agreements or any multilateral process. And that said, the fact is that trade liberalisation often occurs through negotiated trade agreements, and we know that well. Over and above the benefits yielded by unilateral trade liberalisation, trade agreements can provide a further stimulus to trade through the greater access they provide to trading partners' markets. That's a no-brainer. But can I just say a few things about trade agreements here? Modern trade agreements are not just about getting tariffs down. They are much more than that. They usually cover services and investments as well as goods. Second, they are as much about removing barriers behind a border as they are at removing barriers at the border. Thirdly, trade agreements, beyond the kind of technical aspects of them, also deliver possibly the most valuable commodity to business. And what that is confidence about the operating environment. When two countries, pulled a trade agreement together. Others think there is something of substance here. I can do business here. They provide basically more certainty about the rules under which business will then operate. And finally, trade agreements, if they really are going to work, they have to be comprehensive. They should set an environment that is broad enough for trade and investment between the partners to evolve over time, to grow into new areas beyond focusing just on the products and services that are being traded right now. And I'd like to also, having said all those things about what trade agreements are, I just want to say a couple of things about what trade agreements are not. First of all, they're not about balancing bilateral trade flows between the partner countries. In a multi-country world, and one where imports from one country become an input for exports to another country, it just makes no sense to try to even up the exports and imports between individual countries. I hope you can see the logic of that. And let me give you an example. Australia recently concluded free trade agreements with our 3 major North Asian trading partners, China, Japan, and Korea. We run substantial trade surpluses with all those countries, and that's simply because we export mineral and energy resources to these countries. Those countries take our exports, turn them into value-added manufacturing and manufactured goods, and then they export them to other trading countries. And this is a network of, trading relationships that happen. So the trade imbalances, when we were negotiating, the trade imbalances between our 2 countries were not something that we thought we had to solve. And we don't tend to hear a great deal about trade deficits with these countries these days because we recognise the mutual benefits of the trade. And it leads me to a more general point that's applicable to trade agreements, as it is to all trade. And that is that the simple arithmetic of imports and exports doesn't really shed a great deal of light on who is gaining from the trade. The fundamental insight into trade is that both parties can benefit from the one commercial transaction. Trade is not about winning more than the other party. It's about win-win, to use kind of a management term. So whatever the relative size of the partners, this is the case. A bigger economy might have bigger markets, but it will also have more consumers, more businesses to benefit from global inputs, and more exporters ready to enter new markets. Australia's longest standing FTA, free trade agreement, is with our close neighbour New Zealand. And New Zealand has an economy about 1/8 the size of Australia. We also then, on the other hand, have FTAs with the world's 3 largest economies, US, China, Japan. And these, all of them taken together, have been negotiated to deliver mutual benefits, despite the asymmetries in the size of the economies. Given the benefits of an open trade environment, we can see continued efforts over time to develop the institutional means to better achieve those benefits. On the multilateral front, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which was well and truly alive when I joined the Foreign Service, was first created in 1947. 1947 was before I joined the Foreign Service, just to be clear. At that early stage, when the GATT was first floated, it was pretty modest. It was about 23 countries. So perhaps we more accurately describe it as a plurilateral agreement. Down the track, of course, the World Trade Organization was created in 1995, and it now has a membership of 160 states covering most of the globe. Like India, Australia sees the multilateral route as the first best option to achieve trade liberalisation and reform. And I keep going back to the points that Mr. Hoda made at the start. We started off very, very firm multilateralists. And I want to be clear, we remain firm multilateralists. We believe that maintaining a strong and effective multilateral trading system should remain a core trade policy objective for us all. But we have to be absolutely clear about the facts in front of us. At the present time, there seems no viable prospect of a big multilateral deal. There have been 15 years of negotiations in the WTO Doha round with minimal progress, notwithstanding the tangible but limited outcomes recently at the Nairobi Ministerial, including on agricultural subsidies and on the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Nonetheless, the benefits from a more economically integrated international environment still stand. So, in these circumstances, it is sensible to look at other pathways to achieve progress in international trade, while also remaining committed to exploring what is possible in the WTO. That takes us to where bilateral and regional FTAs come in as a major part of the international trade architecture today. There are now over 300 free trade agreements in existence globally, with a rapid expansion in the number over the past 20 years. The newest development, and the one that everyone's been talking about, has been the conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which was signed in February this year. The TPP involves 12 countries representing almost 40% of global GDP, including the United States, Japan, and Australia. Its outcomes include new market access opportunities amongst its members by establishing a more seamless trade and investment environment across 12 countries. The TPP will eliminate 98% of tariffs among the member countries. It will facilitate trade in other ways, and this goes to this kind of the broader, more comprehensive elements I was talking about earlier. Customs procedures will be made more transparent and efficient. It will establish regional rules of origin and a single set of documentary procedures for products that are traded under the TPP. And this will support the development of regional supply chains. And there will also be mechanisms to address non-tariff barriers to concentrate on better transparency, cooperation, and the promotion of good practice in technical regulation. And just in keeping with its badging as a 21st century agreement, the TPP will address a range of contemporary trade challenges such as e-commerce, state-owned enterprises, and small and medium enterprises. And I'm happy to go into a bit more detail on that, but I'll just keep going on to the next regional agreement, which is, of course, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. With the TPP now finalised, and just to be clear, the TPP, while it does have 12 member countries, remains open for new members to join in the future. But now that the TPP is finalised, the focus is now on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which I'm going to refer to as the RCEP. RCEP negotiations involve the 10 ASEAN members and ASEAN's 6 FTA partners, which include India and Australia. And it holds significant economic potential. RCEP countries account for almost half the world's population, nearly 30% of global GDP, and over a quarter of world exports. The global importance of RCEP countries will only grow into the future. Through commitments on goods, services, and investment, RCEP will provide the economic architecture to support ongoing trade and investment liberalisation in the region. Its potential significance for India should not be underestimated. It represents a substantial market for Indian goods, services, but also for Indian technology, intellectual property, and human capital. It would help provide India access to the region's vast pools of capital, and I know that's one of the things India is looking to attract at the moment, because it's so vital to building the infrastructure necessary to support a modern Indian economy. And from my perspective, India should have a voice, a regional voice, that is commensurate with its size and economic weight. Australia supports India's growing participation in the economic architecture of the region. And we demonstrate this simply by a simple device. We continue to refer to the region as the Indo-Pacific. We moved away from a phrasing of the Asia-Pacific. And we've done that because we recognise the very great importance of ensuring that India is part of the regional mindset for us. RCEP, therefore, in my mind, provides an ideal forum in which India can contribute to shaping and influencing the rules governing trade and investment in the region. Australia is keen to work with India to achieve a sufficiently ambitious RCEP outcome. But in addition to the RCEP, I think I'd be remiss not to mention the free trade agreement that Australia is negotiating with India, the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, or the CECA. This is an agreement that promises to deliver substantial benefits to both countries, allowing us to meet at least some of the unfulfilled potential I referred to earlier. For India, CECA will give improved access to the Australian economy. And let's bear in mind, it's not a small economy, it's the world's 12th largest economy. It's an affluent market, and Australia has the world's 5th highest per capita income. With over half of India's exports to Australia currently facing tariffs, it would quickly put India on the same tariff-free footing as our existing FTA partners, such as China, including for key Indian exports such as textiles and clothing, automotive parts and jewellery. And the CECA will also facilitate investment flows with Australia, which has the world's 3rd largest pool of investment funds under management. Something like about $3 trillion we have available to invest. So having touched on some current FTA developments, I'll have to note that not everyone is comfortable with FTAs. And this is a long-running debate. Jagdish Bhagwati's warning about a spaghetti bowl of FTA rules is, I think, an absolutely fair one. There are complexities that can arise from a plethora of FTAs. Commentators have sometimes suggested that bilateral and regional agreements are a diversion from the multilateral main game. But an observation made in the WTO's World Trade Report in 2011 is a very telling one. The report says there's been a creative tension between regional and bilateral and multilateral approaches, which, although often complicated, has generally advanced trade openness and economic integration. This is an important observation. It underscores the important contribution that high-quality FTAs can make to maintaining momentum on trade liberalisation. So I've referred to the 2 free trade agreements that Australia and India are currently engaged in, the bilateral CECA, the regional RCEP. I think these negotiations are very exciting developments. The World Trade Report is a reminder that we should see these developments in the context of the broader sweep of history. I see CECA and RCEP, along with other such trade liberalisation endeavours, as critical ways of moving forward, of testing ourselves on what we can do to open our economies, and of learning how we can achieve gains. These may be smaller steps than a major WTO outcome. And they're not easy steps either, as we know as we go through the negotiations. They're very complex negotiations. They have many moving parts and many competing interests to consider, which is why sometimes our timelines and our ambitions for completion are not always met. But it's absolutely worth the effort. This effort takes us in the right direction. We should really see these trade negotiations as planks in a bridge that's constructed over time, a bridge that will carry us to a world with increasingly lower barriers to international economic activity, and with the important benefits it will deliver globally and especially for developing countries. So I, in my role, look forward to the further strengthening and the deepening of the economic partnership between Australia and India, including through the mutually beneficial opportunities that these agreements deliver. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, High Commissioner. So, well, we have listened to a very comprehensive and deep analysis of the pathways to liberalization, and particularly the way Australia and India have moved on this pathway. I would now throw open the floor for discussion. Please introduce yourself and be brief. Yes, please.
Thank you, Excellency, for your elaborate speech on the trade liberalization. My question to you, I'm Vijay Naik, I'm a journalist. My question to you is that both India and Australia have entered into a historic agreement so far as the supply of uranium from Australia is concerned. Now, whether that supply has started from Australia, number one. Number two, what do you think about, and what is the status about Adani's investment in coal sector in Africa, in Australia? And what do you think about the importance of Indian Ocean when you talk about trade liberalization? Thank you.
Thank you. Let us take two, three questions. Ashok, yes, carry on.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for an excellent presentation. Very thought-provoking. I'm Ashok Sajanhar. I'm a former ambassador to some countries. My question is on, you mentioned about RCEP, you mentioned about SICA. Could you also share your thoughts about what is the likelihood in terms of timeline? RCEP, we were hearing that it will be concluded by 2016. Is it likely to happen? SICA, what is the timeline? And then you also referred to Jagdish Bhagwati saying, the spaghetti bowl. But he's also mentioned that we should try to at least create a Doha light. What you mentioned, that there is no possibility of a mega trade deal. But then whatever has, TFA of course was one of the aspects, but there are so many other things that have come. Do you think there is a reasonable likelihood of a Doha light happening in the coming year or so? The other aspect that I would like your thoughts would be, you mentioned that trade liberalization per se is beneficial for economic development and growth. Now we see, as far as India is concerned, we have had over the last 20 months, there has been a decrease in exports. So with such anemic international demand and such anemic international activity, do you think still under these circumstances also, international trade has a very significant role to play as far as economic growth and development of countries are concerned? Thank you.
Was there a hand I saw here? Yes, carry on. The last one before I ask High Commissioner to respond.
I'm former professor of JNU, Mukherjee. I'm referring to one of the recent studies by Professor Drisdale of ANU, who has pointed to the immense trade diversion that has taken place Australia, India, Australia, US, FTA. So what this really implies that it cannot always be a win-win situation. It depends how you negotiate, and your negotiating skills have to be really good to get the benefits. Now, the delay in SICA, do you think it's because we are waiting for the RCEP to come throughout and show results? And are you likely to wait until that happens before you take up SICA? Is that the reason for the delay?
Now I would like to invite you to these three, and then
There'll be another round.
Next round. Wait for the next round.
Okay. By the way, thank you all so much for being so patient with me, with my voice being the way it is. So it's very kind of you. Goodness me. So these aren't 3 questions. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 questions. So let me go as quickly as I can through them. So first of all, uranium supply from Australia, yes. We've concluded the civil nuclear agreement. There is very active, as you know, concluding contracts for supply can take some time. Can I just say, and because of commercial confidentiality, I obviously can't give you much detail, but I can say there is active interest and active engagement now underway on the supply of uranium to India. I'm genuinely hopeful because these are now being done in a commercial basis. The government, in a sense, has done its job. in concluding the civil nuclear agreement. I'm hopeful that we will see contracts concluded and supplies start to happen, in a relatively short space of time. So that's one positive. You asked about the status of Adani's investment in Australia. So, as you know, there's been a process that it's had to go through. We are very, very proud of the environmental protections we offer in our country, but we are always working to balance that with the interests of investors and commercial. We just don't see that, commercial development and environmental protection, that we don't see them as at odds, we see them together. But the Adani investment has now concluded it's gone through all the hoops, it's gained all its environmental approvals, it has just been granted its mining lease a couple of months ago. I can't recall the exact timing, but it hasn't been very long. And so effectively it has everything it needs now to start its work, to gain its financing and go forward. As far as I know, the way is clear for Adani at the moment. You asked me about the importance of the Indian Ocean as a region. So because I mentioned we use this phrase Indo-Pacific. and it's kind of like we woke up one day and realised that one side of Australia faces the Pacific Ocean and the other side faces the Indian Ocean. And because we've been looking north, because China and Japan and Korea have been such a big part of Australia's economic relationship for so long, I think, that's kind of preoccupied our attention. I think in the last few years, what we've seen is greater Indian Ocean engagement. So we were chair over the years 2014, 2015 of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. It was kind of fortunate that at that stage, key Australian ministers, including our foreign minister, came from Perth, which is the Indian Ocean facing part of the country, and so really drove that forward. For us, looking across the Indian Ocean and drawing connections there is something we're paying much more attention to. To be frank, the trade links and the economic links across the Indian Ocean are not as developed as they are across the Pacific Ocean. That's just a fact. But that's not to say that will always be that way. So we're looking much more at economic architecture. We're looking at driving economic outcomes. So, for example, what we're calling the blue economy, the maritime aspects of the Indian Ocean is something we're spending a lot more time and energy on at the moment. And so I do think that it's probably at an earlier stage of development, but it's definitely something we're working towards. Right, the next set of questions on the timelines for RCEP and CICA. My voice may have given way at this point, but I thought I was being very clear in saying these are very complex negotiations. It is actually very difficult to place a timeline on them. And I think our approach has been to say we would rather have a good outcome than an outcome that doesn't quite get up to standard because we've been pushing to a timeline. What I can say on the CICA is that negotiations have been proceeding at quite a pace for quite some time now. In response to your question, sir, about the relationship between CICA and RCEP, whether or not we would want to, put one off for the other, I'd say that's not the case. We don't really see them as linked. We see the two as complementary, but not necessarily one bouncing off the other. You can. And we've all got histories of being in regional trade agreements and being in bilateral trade agreements with the same countries and having very particular, much more tailored objectives with the bilateral agreements. And that's exactly how we're approaching that. At the moment today, our country is in caretaker mode. So negotiations, obviously, until our federal election on the 2nd of July, are a little bit in abeyance. But I have every confidence that we'll be taking it up again as soon as those elections are settled and the new government is in place. So that's the CICA. A Doha Light. I don't know that we would be formally driving at that. What I will say is the WTO has been engaging on that to some extent because for example, it's come out on smaller agreements, for example, on information technology, on environmental goods. There have been kind of subset agreements that have come out of the WTO. And it may just be that that is the way it is, and perhaps that starts being a jumping off point for a broader negotiation. But I don't want to speculate about, what the shape of a WTO outcome might be down the track. Weaker international demand. It's a little bit about the way you see trade, I think. And, one of the things it would seem to me to be obvious is to look at comparative advantage. In an environment where there's weak international demand, one of the things that has happened has been a significant drop in commodity prices and input prices, effectively. If you are in India and you have a Make in India program, I would be saying these are very great input, a great time now to increase our inputs into our manufacturing sector so that we can produce manufacturers in a more competitive way, so that we can serve the consumers of India better. So it's a question of how you approach and how you want to calibrate the situation. I think, we have to be honest about the way that the global economy is at, and I would suggest we take a long view. This seems to me, a good time to pull harness your resources and set yourself up for the next wave. And just as an example, or to explore other elements of international engagement. So I can't preach to India too much, but really what I can say is the Australian experience. With the drop in commodity prices, this has been had a very significant impact on the Australian economy, which has relied on commodity exports, as I've said, for quite some time. What we recognised is that a significant part of our economy is actually services. We're a knowledge economy, right? So we're now putting a lot of effort into innovation, IT, the knowledge end, the high-tech, the high knowledge end of our economy, and engaging in the global economy there. Why? Because we know we have a competitive advantage there. So I guess the answer is examine where your competitive advantages lie in the circumstances you find yourself in. Find the long view. And the question about trade diversion. So there's endless debate about the trade diverting aspects of FTAs. I joined the Foreign Affairs Department probably just before the Uruguay round kicked off, I think. And I've seen the debates about free trade agreements and trade diversion for a long time. I think where I would stand now, and I was trying to say this in my speech, is this. A trade agreement is just more than just about the trade between the two countries. What we find is it tends to drive a set of changes in your domestic economy. And, it may be that the trade agreement's driving it, but essentially what happens is if you're going to have to streamline regulation for the sake of a trade agreement outcome, you end up streamlining the regulation across the board. What does that do? That just simplifies and improves the internal business environment for your own companies as well. So we start seeing, and these are harder to quantify. It's much easier to quantify how many goods are crossing borders, right? It's really hard to quantify services, and it's really hard to quantify the economic impacts of things such as better regulation, smoother processes, improved clarity in terms of labelling, those kinds of things. But they do have economic benefits. And so I guess the answer there from where I stand is to look at the big view, and certainly that's been the view that the Australian government's taken with the Australia-US FTA. Our view is it has set us up better domestically to be, in the end, a more competitive economy internationally.
Thank you. I think we could go for a second round, and I had seen some hand there, please. So, and then you.
I'm Dinesh Sharma, I'm a journalist. I have two questions. China is very much against India's membership to NSG. What is the stand of Australia on this issue? Secondly, if Mr. Donald Trump is elected, he says that he will minimize the involvement of United States in this Asia-Pacific region. How will Australia react to this?
Yes, please.
My question is, it's quite nice to promote liberalization and promote trade. But what happens to the environment? Trade and environment was something which was to be taken up, has not been taken up. And more so with the commodities where the volumes, weights are very high, the freight, the ship, the air, a lot of CO2 emission takes place. So is it really worth, are we not working against our SDGs, Sustainability Development Goals? And the second thing I want was industry-specific question. What is policy of trade in pharma products of Australia? Pharmaceuticals. Two questions.
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Masfau Dingamo from Ethiopian Embassy. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for this carefully crafted speech. That's very nice. I would like to bring to your attention two issues. I don't know how you see this trade liberalization with the regional economic integration issue, how this can be interrelated, number one. And what about the impact of this liberalization to smaller economies which are already in the region? You know, if they come to this integration issue. So if there is any study on this, on the impact of this liberalization to those economies. If you have some, just please forward it. Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps we can take one more question. Yes, please. Yeah.
Your Excellency, I'm Yogendra Kumar, a former Indian ambassador. I want to take you back to the question regarding RCEP and FTA or CICA between India and Australia. The question I want to ask you actually is that maybe in terms of, maybe you have internal debates in Australia itself as to the advantage of pursuing both these tracks with India, because both of them actually are for comprehensive economic agreement. So I'm just wondering, just maybe a little tangible feel about the issues which you think are specific to India-Australia CICA and which are distinct from RCEP, and whether the two tracks will actually progress in tandem, because if they're outcome-oriented, then I guess one particular outcome, will that affect the outcome expectation from the other track? And the third point I want to make actually here is that one is reading reports, I think our Commerce Minister said that in the RCEP negotiations, I think extraneous elements are being brought in, which actually goes beyond the mandate of RCEP, but bringing in, let us say, the elements from TPP, particularly IP issues. So I'm wondering, with all these complex tracks on which, let's say, Australia is moving, I'm wondering if you can give a little sense as to the tangible feel of the issues involved in both. Thank you.
Yes, I come.